Hey everybody, Ben Pekulski, recording another amazing episode of the Muscle Intelligence Podcast for you. Thank you so much for being here. Today I sit down with a great friend of mine, Killian Hamilton. Killian is a new friend and someone you're going to want to pay attention to now and in the future. This guy's mind is an absolute gift to humanity. His ability to think on a deep level is second to very few people. And we had first a brilliant conversation here in my facility, and then we sat down today remotely and talked about programming and skill acquisition. And now, why do you care about that? Skill acquisition is, in my eyes, the missing link in having you feel empowered when you go into the gym, whether it be yourself or your clients. Sometimes working out can feel disempowering because you're just like, I'm not sure if this feels good. I don't really like this. I don't really feel like I'm getting a reward for the amount of work that I'm putting in. And the missing link then is not hard work. It's skill acquisition. I've been the one talking about this and shouting from the mountaintops for the last 10 years, but there's never been anyone who sat down and actually created a quantified course. And Killian has done that. And I invited him on today to talk about what he's learned in creating this course and ultimately how to help you and me and all of our clients acquire a skill, whether that be in the gym or outside the gym. There's still a very particular process that you should be going through to allow you to feel empowered, right? When we start something, let's say we start playing the piano, it's not going to be the most empowering thing. Sometimes it's a bit of a struggle. It's like you're pushing against something. And then once you hit it, once you feel just a little bit of empowerment, you get that hit of dopamine, and now you want to do it again and again and again, because now I feel good about this thing. Gosh, I feel really great. I did something really well today. Celebrating those wins and moving toward the ultimate goal. So Killian and I, as I say, sit down today to talk about programming. So how to ultimately build skill acquisition into this programming process, and why programming is probably the missing link for most people. Most people go in the gym and just guess, and they don't build any progress into their workouts. And if you don't build progress into the workouts, progress doesn't happen by accident. So we're going to walk you through this very logical, intentional process of skill acquisition being the foundation for all things we do, and then maybe how to progress through the next 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and 12 months, and ultimately how to intentionally build training progress into the program. So progress for you is an inevitability, and you're getting to where you want to go rather than guessing. And today's podcast is brought to you guys by Blue Blocks, my favorite blue blocking glasses, which I'm wearing right now. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see how awesome they are. And they block my eyes from blue light. So I'm sitting in front of a computer. And if you ever watch me on the podcast, you'll laugh. I'm going to point this out. But my eyes get very dry and they get very tired because I'm staring at these blue lights. I'm squinting and I'm not able to keep my eyes open. And as soon as I put on blue blockers, my eyes just feel better. And Blue Blocks is the highest quality blue blocking lens that exists. They have special patented lenses, and the ones I'm wearing right now are called Smith, and I think they're pretty awesome. And I'm sure you will too. If you guys haven't already picked up a pair of Blue Blocks, head over to blueblocks.com and use the code MUSCLE to get hooked up with 15% off, BLUBLOX.com/muscle, and you will get 15% off. They ship worldwide. There's no cost, and they're the highest quality styles. They've got a ton of really cool stuff. They've also recently released a red light, so an infrared light that you can shine on particular parts of your body. This is a mobile red light to increase mitochondrial function, decrease inflammation. I shine it on my head. I also shine it on my testicles. My head is going to decrease brain inflammation. My testicles is going to improve testosterone production, maybe what the research is showing. I'm like, hey, you know what? I'll take a chance on that. If it'll improve the energy production in those cells, oftentimes the cells are better able to do what they want to do. So without further ado from me, enjoy this podcast with Killian Hamilton. Don't forget to listen all the way to the end. And if you aren't already listening on Spotify, that's where I've started listening now. I think Spotify is an awesome place to listen to all your podcast needs. You can find the Muscle Intelligence Podcast on Spotify and listen to me on every one of your workouts. Have a great day, guys. I love you, and enjoy the show. Killian Hamilton, my man, what's going on?
Nothing much, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing very well, buddy. I'm so grateful for you joining. We had an amazing conversation on the RX Radio podcast, and that went live, and people love that. And I'm so grateful to have you on to get you to talk about your zone of genius, or maybe one of your many zones of genius. And skill acquisition and programming is the topic of today. And you've created a course on skill acquisition. And, this speaks to my heart because for the last probably 10 years, I've been the one screaming at people that skill acquisition is maybe the weak link, or prior to a couple of years ago, maybe it was a weak link in most people's armor. And I think it's the most important aspect of progress that's being overlooked, right? If I don't have the skill, I can't scale. I can't ultimately scale volume or intensity or anything, at least not accurately. And so I'm super grateful for you being here to tell us all about skill acquisition.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben. I think it's really cool because if we were to look at my interest in skill acquisition, it comes from a lot of previous influence, and two of those big influences are yourself and Jordan Shallow. And I think Shallow is pretty infamous at this point for saying the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And I think in the hypertrophy and bodybuilding side of things, there's no one that does mastery more or with the continuity that you do it. So in looking at both of you guys, as I came up in this industry, for me, it was a natural progression of moving from being a carpenter to moving into strength training and understanding that there's mastery in all motor unit recruitment, and we see this in the trades, we see this in art, we see this in music, and to think that everyone else who uses their hands on a fine and gross motor skill level goes through stages of skill acquisition to get to the mastery that they achieve. We need to look at the weight room no differently, because I think when we look at even strength, and especially in bodybuilding, we're looking at people who are searching from day one for mastery of a given task.
Man, that's so interesting. So most people just go in and do the task, right? They don't think about the doing the task. They just do the task. And then so I'm the one coming along like 10 years ago and going, hey, great, you're doing the task. That's a great place to start. That's very beginner level. Now let's start thinking about how you do the task, right? And then my progression from there is, once you've thought about doing the task, now you have to embody the task. And that's ultimately this idea of maybe unconscious competence, where first it goes from conscious incompetence, or maybe unconscious incompetence, where I don't know what I don't know, and then progressing through that kind of quadrants of understanding what I'm doing, and then progressing to doing it most effectively. And that's hopefully where everyone should be striving to sit or exist. I think when you're trying to get good at something, when you want to build a body, when you want to get really strong, my belief is unconscious competence is a necessity. You agree on that?
100%. And I think that's what, like, we look at the Fitz-Posner model, that's autonomy, right? Autonomy is unconscious competence in a task. My ability to sit down and with a low neurological workload, train a given motor unit task without having to think about it.
Yeah. So if I'm incorrect in saying this, obviously correct me. It sounds like this course you've developed is literally expediting the process through these four quadrants of progressing toward autonomy.
100%. Like, the goal is that you, as a coach leaving the course, can implement skill acquisition in programming and in communication in an autonomous fashion. And the goal would be you've expedited the process for client or athlete to move to an autonomous position of execution in their given sport or task.
Man, it gets me so excited. Like, literally, I'm jumping here to think about this happening, because I go through my process in my own head. Like, before we started the call, we started talking about programming, and I write everyone's initial program with this in mind. Like, what is the best approach? And obviously, that's a way overgeneralized statement. But what's the best approach for an average person, let's say, to improve skill across the board? And then acknowledging also that the skill of the squat may be completely different than the skill of a bench press, based on mechanics, based on history, based on all these factors. So it gets me really excited to think of, like, someone's actually put more thought into this than me. So start walking us down the path of, Betty Sue walks into the gym and Frankie Bob walks into the gym, and they're like, hey, Killian, I'd like to be a professional bodybuilder, or I'd like to be a powerlifter, or I'd like to be an Olympic athlete, Olympic lifter. What does it look like to begin?
So I think the first stage we go through in skill acquisition, and the way that conversation really derives itself and translates to the weight room, is understanding there needs to be a level of cognition. When we approach...
So when you say cognition is like awareness? A
level of awareness. Now we can bring levels of awareness through knowledge, right? We delineate ignorance through knowledge. The more we understand something, the more aware we are of what it is. And then secondly, perception of it, being exposed to it in a gradient fashion in which we can gain a better perception to what we're experiencing. So that would be like the schema theory, right? Identifying schemas is a way to get rid of anxiety. It's a way to build confidence. It's a way to build adherence and awareness to uncommon situations. So I think...
Can you describe what that is? Because I wouldn't assume the listener would know.
Oh yeah, so for sure. So understanding like a schema theory is understanding a way to assess, understand, react, and adapt to any given situation you're put in based on a level of cognition and a level of perception to previous like scenarios. So if I were to see a hot stove, which I experienced once in my life, I had I had one side of the schema. I understood that a stove was hot because things were removed from the stove and they were cooked. But I had never felt what the heat on a stove was like. So I only had understandings of other things that may have been hot in the past. The sun, the pavement, bath water. So in order for me to understand the stove was dangerous, I needed to put my hand on the stove. Now, when I'm in positions of a heat source, I have a better schema theory around how to understand and adapt to that. If I see a flame, a fireplace, a burner is on, I now have the cognition of what heat is and what it does. And I have the perception of having felt heat to an extreme degree.
Got it. So with respect to skill acquisition as it applies to exercise specifically, because obviously it can apply to anything, people need to start, again, this is the foundation of everything, which is why I've become such an advocate of, consciousness, conscious training, mindful training. Is like, I just need to bring you into this space. Mm-hmm. I need to bring you into your body. And so many people exist outside of their body, right? Or maybe they exist in their head, but they can't feel their body. They can't connect with their body. So step one in making people aware. And let's walk us down that path.
Yeah. So the first step in awareness or cognition would be, if we were to look at the gym, is mobility, right? Is when we look at mobilizing to an efficient and expedient manner, it's understanding that we're entering into unstable positions neurologically, not changing physical properties of, say, muscle fiber. So understanding that I want someone to gain that awareness of end ranges by putting them into a safe enough position that they can neurologically open that window or that stopgap to that range, show shortened or lengthened ranges. And this is where we'll see a lot of mobility, or like you practice yoga, and it's incredible for finding and establishing end ranges in a safe manner, in a room that is calming, where the lights are down, where you're not assessing risk constantly, and then adapting those new end ranges from a mobility standpoint to greater and greater stability. And stability is simply a perturbation to a position or movement. Perturbation being a distal challenge to a proximal level of stability. Proximity being a joint or midline with what we would call like a proximal location.
Yeah, one of the things that drew me to yoga, we'll say, is getting into uncomfortable positions, and you talk end ranges, and obviously having to relax into it, but also this bridging the gap into stability, because now I'm so focused on having to breathe into it, stay there, become more stable, and I'm becoming centered in my breath. So I'm becoming centered in my diaphragm. And I found the rate of improvement to almost all of the exercise I did in the gym was surprisingly fast. And, that came from upper body, lower body, all of, what we'll call the hubs of stability just started to seem a lot more solid and a lot more reliable, right? There was less unpredictability there. I could just ultimately take what I applied in yoga and apply it immediately into training. And that sounds counterintuitive, but based on what you're saying, it sounds like it's almost a perfect fit.
Yeah, and I think that's really the first step in cognition, right? Or into skill acquisition in the weight room is getting into unstable or uncomfortable positions, staying there long enough that you can actually create an adaptation to the position, and then creating a challenge to that position being stability, or a perturbation of movement, creating a greater and greater distal challenge, or range of motion to something would be a distal challenge away from proximal stability. And what that allows you to do is build a capacity. So in that cognitive phase, we're building an unloaded capacity to end range. This is something that anybody can recover from at a really exponential rate. Absolute load will always be absolute load. I think there's a famous quote, 200 pounds is always 200 pounds. And that's very much true. And that's something that at some points are going to have detrimental effects on recovery, whereas perturbations or distal challenges to proximal stability is something that we can engage in and recover from at a high frequency.
Very cool. So I think that in of itself, within what we just talked about in the first 5 minutes, is a huge skill, like a huge component of, because you mentioned mobility, and we certainly don't want to breeze over that because that needs to be walked through. Then you mentioned bridging the gap into stability. So just because I have mobility obviously doesn't mean I have stability. And most people will associate mobility and flexibility. So I'd like to differentiate there. And I'd also just like to go down the path of, well, what does it look like to start scaling mobility? Do you have a suggested progress method, or is it just like, hey, go there and spend time there?
Yeah, so I think when we look to scale mobility, I would always link it directly to stability. So I think oftentimes we remove the idea of test, retest that I think a lot of us have learned from the countless certifications we've probably all taken and schools we've been to. But in scaling mobility, it's only as relevant as the stability we can apply to it. If I can get my hand over my head unloaded, if I have the flexibility to get up here, but I can't operate in or understand my positions overhead, that's not something I can stabilize, therefore not something that I can train. So when looking to improve mobility, it can't be done in isolation. It should be tied to relative challenges in stability or perturbations to movement. If someone has base level hip flexibility at the joint, they have relative levels of mobility in the glute through functions of the hip. They can operate in internal, external rotation, adduction, abduction. Then a relative baseline test in stability for them might be a single leg glute bridge, something that works in lower levels of extension at the hip, greater levels of flexion, and is for the most part relatively supported from a larger base of support. Now they can scale greater and greater degrees of mobility at the hip from ranges of motion in a 90-90 to gait cycle in a walking lunge or sprinter pose or runner's lunge. And they can start to scale those with gradients and extension at the hip from single leg glute bridge to single leg RDL to hip airplane is a very common progression I think we see more often than not nowadays.
How much do you consider neuromuscular orchestration from a perspective of patterns? So, obviously we know the body moves in patterns, but some people will kind of push back on these things, meaning you can reestablish a pattern by consciously reestablishing a pattern, but you may also be able to reestablish a pattern by removing the barrier to the pattern. In this case, hey, you lack mobility here. If I just improve the mobility, it may actually change the sequencing. What approach would you suggest people take? So giving context for the listener, if I notice that I'm doing a movement and it looks relatively sloppy, it doesn't feel very stable, things don't seem to be very well coordinated. Obviously, there's a few levels of approach, right? I can do the thing over and over again. I can do it slowly and try to change the way I do it, or maybe even I could, mobilize first in some way that loosens up some joint range that then changes the mechanics in of itself. And maybe all of those exist, but I'd love to have you walk through, someone who's, hey, maybe I have the requisite mobility here, but I'm not necessarily doing this thing correctly, or at least what I would judge or my trainer may judge as correctly.
Yeah, and I think this is where we actually start to see the format of skill acquisition over the course of a session or over the course of, say, a week or block of training be implemented isn't exactly what you're saying here, is understanding that if we do have requisite mobility, but what we're lacking is stability, either stability in positions or strength in end ranges, what we'd want to do is we would want to find autonomous work thereafter to supplement that. So if we talk about hip extension, which is a pretty common thing we see poor positions adopted into, hip extension, hip hinge would be a better term for most people, or deadlifting. See a lot of hip hinging and deadlifting movements fall heavily into a more anterior path, more lumbar flexion or thoracic flexion. But what we would want to do is we would want to find a highly detailed gradient scale or exposure to extension at the hip, where we're creating these perturbations or distal challenges. Now, this could come from external stabilization, and it could even come from finding isometric positions in which we want to get into and stabilizing from there. So we could see someone who does have poor movement patterning in a hinge. They could mobilize glute, they could mobilize the lat, they could do whatever requisite mobility provides a like or greater stimulus to that person. So training age is going to greatly affect the mobility chosen. Someone who works at a desk all day, maybe a general population clientele, probably won't need the foam roller or the steel pipe to the low back to get them to move better. They might need, a runner's lunge. They may need to lay in child's pose and tell you about their day for 5 minutes and kind of shed the weight of the day. And that might be the mobility requisite for them.
So we're almost looking for like an autonomic volume switch, right? An autonomic dimmer switch.
Exactly. We're just trying to do that. And that's understanding, where is the stimulus coming from this person and where they're prepared. Like, you and I get to deal with such a large population of clientele and of friends knowing their backgrounds. I know that for me to adopt to end ranges and unstable positions, for yourself to adopt to end ranges and unstable positions, it's going to require a far greater stimulus than, say, my mom. My mom might just need to get into a child's pose. She might just need to, go for a 5-minute walk, take greater stride lengths, consciously breathe and stop thinking about her day, throw sand on.
And from your perspective, is that tissue quality primary? What's the biggest influence? Tissue quality? Is it autonomic arousal? Is it health of the system? Is it accumulation of some type of fibrotic tissue? Like, what are all the variables that contribute there? Because I always want to try to quantify that, right? Because my brain goes to, I would like to return to the mobility and stability that I had when I was 16, 18 years old. And like, how do we then start getting rid of all these variables, right? So it's the meditation, it's the yoga, it's maybe the fibrotic, getting rid of the fibrotic tissue and the inflammation.
I think that's the thing, is we start to look at stress and allostatic load as aggregate, right? And we start to understand the inputs people are putting into their system. And that's where taking a history of your client or taking a history of an athlete and looking externally versus internally at the weight room when assessing what is necessary in a cognitive phase to begin to learn a new task, right? And for most people, it's going to take a lot of variables to start to zero in on, and what we just have to find are the easiest ones to control, or the ones in which we get the greatest buy-in to control. So I think like an autonomic attenuation is the first thing that we look at. I think when we look at training age and sport of athlete, tissue tolerance and tissue quality becomes largely responsible as well.
Yep.
And then underlying, health considerations. So like dietary can be huge, right? Inflammatory diets, timing of eating, supplementation, and all those things. But I think first and foremost, it's autonomic. It goes from, what is this person's capacity for stress in a physical and more often neurological sense.
So do you build that into your course, or do you build that into programs? Like, something I've started doing that's very, unusual or atypical is like, I'm very conscious of accessing both extremes of the autonomic nervous system. Like, I'm trying to get super sympathetic, but I'm also trying to get super parasympathetic before. So workouts, I don't know if we did this when you're here, but workouts will often start with like, some bouncing, and then which moves into shaking, which then moves into just almost like ecstatic movement. Sometimes I use some clubs and I'll just kind of like move things around, just trying to loosen up and remove all the tone from places that exist in my body. So it's not stretching per se, but it's mobilizing actively. And my brain goes to like, I'm trying to alleviate tension. I'm trying to increase blood flow. I'm trying to increase viscosity at the joints. I'm literally picturing increasing the gaps, the spaces between joints, and allowing things to flow there. It's been a pretty big difference maker in my ability to access end range with stability.
Yeah, and I think that's something that should be included and taken into account when looking at athletes with greater training ages and more and greater sports history in contact.
What are you trying to say, man?
Trying to say that you're a high level athlete.
You trying to call me an old bastard? Is that what this is?
No. Just trying to fire up a little, but no, I think like we see that in track and field, right? We see that in explosive athletes. Like they will do a lot of warm up, like you said, tonally, right? Like they'll bounce, they'll do A skips, B skips, hops, leg swings. They move dynamically, but we also look at the tissue quality of that athlete, and even in ligament and tendon, they're probably primed for that, inherent quote unquote bounce.
Right.
And for yourself, when you enter a gym, regardless of what's actually going on, front of mind and consciously, you've spent years and years in a gym. I've spent years and years in a gym. Like, I know when I put track spikes on, or I know when I pick up a barbell, my intention and my mindset, regardless of if it's front of mind, changes completely. And I think when we look at these autonomic and even, tonal kind of warm-ups for athletes, it comes from people where we start to disassociate a level of tension that could be unconscious in the athlete. And I think it pays more of a benefit to people like yourself and, even people like myself than it would to the everyday person. I think that everyday person is coming in with outside stress that will probably be decreased in 10 minutes of talking about their favorite TV show. And that could literally be the mobility for that person, or putting on a playlist they like. Like, something I do in the cognitive phase of training, even for myself, and this kind of went viral during our lockdown, was the music I listen to when I train, or the music I listen to when I move through things that are more proprioceptive. Like, I'm not throwing, Metallica on for the hip airplane. It's not necessary. I don't need to become hyped, you know what I mean, to do shoulder dislocates. Like, I need to get into a position where I feel safe, where I feel relaxed, where my breathing is going to.
I'm picturing you like busting out some Enya.
Yeah, that's the move, man. Like, I'll put the Maxwell on, the Jodeci, the Genuine, whatever it might take for me to become relaxed in these positions. But that's all an environmental constraint and input in the system. And those things in cognition need to be accounted for.
Hey, it's Ben, and I want to quickly tell you a story about one of the greatest resources I found on the internet. And I've been using it as far back as 2007 when it was first introduced to me. Back then it was called the Philosopher's Notes. And what it was this brilliant guy started reading books and decided, instead of just allowing this information to pass through, he'd start creating 6-page summary and a 10-page video, and published it on YouTube at the time. And it was the most incredible resource, because I could now, instead of having to read a book and maybe not really love the book, I could check the book out to see if I loved it. And if I loved it, continue to obviously read the book. Or what I noticed was I was getting so much value from the 5 big ideas that he extrapolated from the book that oftentimes I didn't have to read the book. I got the 5 big ideas and I was like, gosh, this is amazing. I understand it. Next. So it really allowed me to accelerate my journey, my personal growth. It allowed me to dig deeper into topics that I love, and maybe not dig so deep into other topics that I didn't love. And Philosopher's Notes has now evolved into optimize.me, one of my greatest resources. And you guys may remember Brian Johnson, who was a guest in the podcast. I asked Brian to join me as a guest, knowing that he doesn't do a lot of interviews because he's a very private guy. He's a very family-oriented guy, very much like me. And we hit it off. And he's become such a great friend. And I really want to support him, his business, and his mission now, and his future mission, which I'll tell you guys about on future podcasts. So if you head over to optimize.me/muscle, Brian and his amazing team at Optimize are going to hook us up with 10% off their already ridiculously low price of $9.97 a month. And for the amount of information you're getting for $9 a month or $10 a month, whatever it equates to be, you're getting 600 different Philosopher's Notes. You're getting hundreds of +1s, which is how to up-level your life, how to give yourself an up-level +1. And you're getting a huge number of mastery notes. So particular topics they choose, and they talk to the experts, and they give you the key items to optimize and master your life. So in weeks to come, I'm going to be bringing you a summary of some of the books that I'm reading, very much in this Philosopher's Notes format. So hopefully I can provide some value for you, some perspective on some of my favorite books of all time, and maybe it'll encourage you to have an opportunity to go over to optimize.me and check it out. I think it's a huge value add. If you guys go, hey, Ben, did you read this book? Do you like it? And I can bring you some information about what I garnered from a book. And if you like that format, you can head over to Optimize and get a very similar thing. Because as I said, I'm just borrowing this format. I'm going to pull my top 5 points out of each book that I'm reading and provide it for you here on the podcast once a week. And I really encourage you to check it out. It's literally the greatest thing that helped me accelerate my journey. And here's another cool thing. What you guys don't know is I also joined the Optimize Coach team. So I've actually paid to become a student of Brian for 300 days. Myself and about 1,000 other coaches are going through this program. And he's giving us the best practices and ultimately a system and a process to follow every single day and every single week to continue to build over 300 days to become the greatest version of ourselves. And it's completely inspiring to be around people who want to thrive, who are doing the work, who are putting in the time, and ultimately creating their greatest life. So head over to optimize.me/muscle and get 10% off with the code muscle10. You can get that off the monthly or off the incredibly low lifetime price as well. So I hope you all check it out. Look forward to hearing from me about the greatest books I've read, and you can head over to Optimize to check those out as well. Back to the show. So does the other end of the spectrum hold true as well? Obviously, I don't have contextual experience, so I can think of a client right now whose muscle tone is that of a overcooked noodle, right? And so they're coming in, they've got very little tone. It's very, very passive and very soft, and almost to the point of passivity, right? It's almost to the point of like they don't have enough muscle tone to generate enough, movement for basic day-to-day tasks. So then would it look like something, hey, we're going to do something to tone up this thing? Like, let's do something that's physically strenuous that allows you to increase the ability to recruit the autonomic nervous system or recruit the central nervous system.
Yeah, and that's where I would look at. That's where I would look at when we have this discussion of stability and base level strength. To go that stability might be our final stage that we really want to get to, and for some people that stage could be far away. And we look at someone who doesn't have that muscle tone, doesn't have that ability or capacity to kind of exert force right out of the gate. Maybe this is someone where we look at base level or attenuated, isometrics in their cognitive phase, where we're finding positions that are more externally stabilized. We're holding positions that we want to find later on, like you kind of talked about these neuromuscular patterns and trading in like currencies. Well, if I want to exert force, from a 90-degree position of knee flexion and hip flexion, and this person doesn't have that muscle tone or capacity to drive force right away, and not even in stability, but in base level strength, well, I'm going to put this person into a position where they're stabilized, that they can then begin to understand it in isometric sense, how to overcome isometrics, right? And overcoming isometrics becomes an immense warm-up in people who don't have that capacity fresh out of the gate.
And that's brilliant. I think every person listening should acknowledge what just exists in there. If you didn't, rewind it, listen to it again. But just this idea of like, as a coach, throwing someone into a complex neurological exercise that they don't know how to move through, that they don't know how to stabilize. And then ultimately moving is obviously incredibly more neurologically, cognitively complex than not moving. So taking out the movement variable and saying, hey, go to this position, which is effectively what you're able to do right now with control. So this is your end range mobility and stability, positions of that you're able to access, and stay there, and then overcome the isometric, pushing into the floor, pushing into the wall, pushing into some machine, and ultimately turning up the volume knob on the central nervous system and saying, hey, you need to get stronger in this position. There's a ton of value in that.
Yeah, and that's where I look to see, like, we're talking a lot about cognitive right now, but I think to look at these phases in isolation over the course of a day is to not pay them the credit where the credit's due in the long term, and to look at, like over a training block, over, multiple cycles, and even over the course of days, is your autonomous work, your end of your workout on the previous day is truly your cognitive prep for the workout of the next day.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, this is something I do a lot with baseball, is baseball players who I know are going to throw, say, on a Friday, I will have the autonomous work that they do on, say, a Thursday. So the end of their workout, if we were to look at alphanumeric exercise selection, the C, D, and E class of their Thursday afternoon workout are actually exercises that are setting up cognitive positions for their throwing game the next day. If I've got a pitcher, I have a pitcher moving into front foot elevated split squat with a contralateral load, suggesting rotation. And I'm having him do face pull, rope face pull high, looking for a position of the scapular plane or scaption, external rotation at the shoulder, not retraction. And he's finding these end ranges. He's starting to kind of draw the circle around the straight line that is his pitching. So we're not innovating pitching mechanics to make him better. We're not tying the baseball to the cable machine. But in that autonomous work, he's finding end ranges of external rotation, holding long isometric tempos in that position, strengthening the end range. Same goes for front foot elevated split squat. Now in the next day, when we put him in those positions, he has the cognition of understanding how to throw and the perception of how end ranges feel. He's now to acquire those positions at a greater rate.
It's very interesting. And I think being cognizant, I love to talk about being cognizant of fatigue at that point, right? Because we're very aware of the reality that too much of that could take away from performance. Just the right amount could actually significantly increase performance. So are you using particular objective or subjective markers to kind of rate where we should stop this stuff?
Yeah. So what I look at this, it's an arbitrary rating scheme that I've given exercises based on modality. So the idea that the medium is the message, that your modality that you choose, modality being the tool you utilize in the gym, brief understanding of modality being barbell, dumbbell, cable machine, and let's go hammer strength machine to just be, kind of common knowledge, a plate loaded machine. Now, when we look at these modalities, each modality is going to have an efficiency rating that drives it towards a certain percentage of intensity or rate of exertion. When we pick up a barbell, we understand that on any given set, we're probably getting at most 5 to 8 reps of maximum muscle fiber recruitment if the intensity is within a range that allows for it. Well, with the barbell, the benefit is I get that muscle recruitment from rep 1. So if I'm picking a barbell up in training, then I'm going to be placing the barbell high in the workout, and I'm going to be driving 75 to 100% intensity on the barbell. That's how I start to look at it. Understanding this, I would want to place that barbell work either earlier on in a week of training or at a day in which I'm starting to catch the crest of the allostatic load of the athlete. Now I'm going to start to look at efficiency drop off in exercise selection based on where I find those 5 to 8 reps of maximum muscle fiber recruitment. But within that, I start to attenuate neurological fatigue based on external stability. So I'm going to go from barbell bilateral, in which I can't allow for adaptation of my own limitations or movement, to a dumbbell. A dumbbell is going to allow me to drive a greater time and distance solely based on the modality, which is the dumbbell. Well, now I'm going to look at probably training within 50 to 75% of my barbell in the same rep range. Well, I obviously now have to do more reps with the dumbbell than I'd have to do with the barbell because I'm accessing those 8 reps later on in the set. So it's going to drop down in the exercise order. The cable machine is probably going to be, 15 to 35% of what I could do with the dumbbell within the given range. Therefore, the cable.
So when you're saying those percentages, are you referring to load specifically, or the amount of challenge to the nervous system?
So I would go load and relative challenge to the nervous system would be the same. A 1 rep max deadlift would be 100+% of your 1 rep max. And that challenge to the nervous system would equivalently should shut you down from hip hinge mechanics for the rest of that day. If you're pulling a max deadlift and then going on to do dumbbell RDL and prone hamstring curl and lat pull down, maybe that wasn't a 1 rep max deadlift, or it probably didn't look very good.
Okay. So, it's funny. I build this into every single workout, right? And I often teach progressing from, most internally stabilized toward most externally stabilized. So, context for the listener: squat is very internally stabilized. It requires all of the muscle to be orchestrated in stability to move you through this locomotive pattern. And then you have a hack squat on the other end of that, which then obviously removes the necessity of stabilizing the spine or anything above the hip effectively. And that's going to be a lot less neurologically taxing, therefore maybe more stimulus directly to a muscle, but less overall neurological fatigue.
Yeah, so I would agree with that entirely. And that is something I think in which we would take training age into account and going, you or I can go barbell back squat to hack squat. And we can drive relative exertion or intensity to create those adaptations. Where I think when we look at a newer training age lifter who say does a barbell back squat in a workout, the relative intensity they would then look to drive on the hack squat, regardless of external stability, they probably don't have the bank account left to expend, right? When they get to that, 2 RIR, 1 RIR in the hack squat, they've already expended that doing the barbell solely on how hard they had to work to do it well and internally stabilized. So what I would look to do in a program with a beginner lifter is, like you had said, to manage for fatigue. I would look at adaptive decay over the week, and I would look to scale these exercises and where they arrive at the workout to drive a higher frequency of like movement pattern over the week, but while attenuating these fatigue markers. So if day 1 A exercise is back squat, day 3 B exercise is hack squat, day 4 the C exercise is rear foot elevated split squat, and then day 5 we have a front foot elevated split squat contralaterally loaded. In the E class, where we'd normally see core work, because now the front foot elevated split squat with a contralateral load exists within knee flexion, abduction, external rotation, but it exists within the core as a means of anti-rotation.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of pull this back a little bit. So give the listeners context or something that just came up in my mind. If we go back to the example we were speaking about, someone that comes in off the road has very low muscle tone, maybe low proprioceptive awareness, low coordination, versus someone who maybe is hypertonic, a little bit overstimulated in the nervous system. So, visually, this one person is representative. And this is just my comical representation of mine, more like an overcooked noodle. And this other one is very rigid and very, very stiff. Based on what you're saying, I feel like, and this may be a massive overgeneralization, but I'd love to discuss it. This person who is less tone, so hypotonic, may have a greater benefit from starting with something like a squat, ramping up because we're actually turning up the neurological demand significantly, versus the other end, someone who comes in and has too much tone may not be able to access those positions. So we're looking for something that would maybe be on the other end. So maybe with them, we start with something like a hammer strength press, because then we actually get some muscular movement, we get some joint movement, maybe align the nervous system from that to actually loosen up and then progress into something that's more, or it almost feels like it's a reverse order, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I would look at, like you said, with like the hypotonic versus hypertonic individual. Is I would look at scaling those weeks from an adaptation standpoint if I'm looking to get into new positions that I can't access. From a point of what I would do with the hypertonic person is actually have them start the week in a front foot elevated split squat.
Yeah, so like the reverse pattern.
Yeah, exactly, the reverse pattern. So day 1 for hypertonic would be front foot elevated split squat. Day 3 might be the back squat, because we've actually we've caught that allostatic load at its highest. And what we've done to them is, like you said, we've turned the volume down.
Right.
Basically provided environmental constraints to their ability to drive that sense of their nervous system. And then I've created my own wave of allostatic load midweek and said, here's where you get to output. And then I've backed them off again. So we see this undulation in where exercises arrive in the order, and if they arrive in cognitive, associative, or autonomous. Much to what you said, like we can prescribe it to hyper and hypotonic individuals as well.
Super interesting. So now this adds a whole nother dimension to my programming understanding, right? So someone comes in and they're, weak for all intents and purposes. They're trying to build muscle. We need a greater neurological demand. We need to challenge the nervous system so the nervous system becomes more effective, more efficient at contracting muscle. Whereas the other person is almost too much, and we need to teach them to dial it down. That's important awareness, maybe for any coach or person listening. So it doesn't even have to exist in one workout, right? Because many people try to make it happen within the confines of a single day, and that ends up being, they're putting themselves in a position that's compromising, ultimately leading down the path of injury and inflammation. So you're suggesting doing this over the span of at least a few days.
I would especially when we look at greater uptakes in skill happen at greater frequencies. The more frequent you can do something, the greater you're going to adapt to the skill. So I think in applying a high frequency approach and not trying to double down on a single day, we remove ourselves from the idea of like that neurological overload, right? Like I'm the biggest fan of Mike Menser. Like I think if there was one guy that's been on my wall since I was a little kid before it was you, was Mike Menser. And I love the idea of just sending it for 2 sets on 4 machines and going home. But I don't like the idea that you have to go home for 15 days before you can get back to the gym.
Right.
That's not just physiological. It's very much neurological. So we look at a guy like Menser, we look at athletes who train at these low frequencies, and we see in a low frequency athlete, we see a high frequency allostatic load. So to provide context, I think everyone's seen kind of what sound waves look like. And that's a way to understand an allostatic load. It looks like a sound wave. There's crests and there's valleys. Now, if I train at a low frequency, I can adapt to high frequency allostatic load because those periods of infrequent training allow for huge spikes in recovery. So we see an opposing wave of allostatic stress load, and we see recovery, and they operate at the same wavelength. So I can always compete at the same level. Now, if we want to get an uptake in skill, and if we want to get an uptake in like newer or beginner physiological adaptation, a higher frequency is often a better approach. But in order to do that with a high frequency training schedule, I have a low frequency allostatic load adaptation. So because of that, I'm not going to be able to see spikes in that performance over the course of each training session, but over the course of longer duration training blocks. And that's something where we see maybe the barbell squat shows up once a week, but we see knee flexion show up 5 times a week. So we're not testing and retesting the barbell squat 1, 2, 3 days a week because you need to train legs 3 days a week. We're seeing the barbell squat show up, the lunge pattern show up, the externally stabilized extension pattern show up. And then we're seeing every 7 to 10 to 14 days that retest of our capacity for skill in the barbell movement.
You know what's really interesting, man? How success leaves clues. Throughout my career, one of the things I was known for is training the same body part on consecutive days. And the first day would often just be playing. It would be 70% effort. And what I noticed was I got exponentially better workouts the following day. There was never eliciting fatigue. It was just like neurological patterning, right? It was just like laying down the foundational patterns, and the next day I'd come back and my workouts would be, call it subjectively 30 to 40% better as far as my ability to get into ranges with stability and do work, and even as far as perceived effort going down. So it sounds like that's what I was doing. Unconsciously, I kind of figured this out. Whereas someone on the other end who maybe is hypertonic or hypotonic may want to do something similar, but a much more neurologically complex workout, pre-hypertrophy workout. So they could almost do 2 workouts on the same day, or one the night before and one the next day, with the intention of increasing the amount of tone.
And that's what I would see from that autonomous work, the autonomous being C, D, and E level exercise, setting up the second days for somebody, like you said, who's hypotonic. The end of day 1 for them might be isometric Bulgarian split squat. It could be isometric hamstring curl. The following day might then be the barbell squat or a hack squat or leg press, in which we've started to overcome those isometrics at the end of, say, Monday, and they do a 6 p.m. session. Tuesday at 6 a.m., they do a barbell squat session. They've already found these isometric positions from which they've gained base levels of strength and stability under time, because the greatest proponent to stability is time, right? Spending time in those positions, because you're resisting force. If I'm not exerting force, if I'm resisting force, I need to be there long enough for forces to begin to impact me. And that's where we get lost in the stability conversation, and in moving fast is we're never anywhere long enough to adapt.
Yeah, my kind of 3 phases of progression that I suggest on my courses is always TDL. Yeah. So it's always time, then distance, then load. And so that's where people usually miss. They go straight to load, right? And they miss the distance piece. And distance is a huge consideration when it comes to, and you talked about that with perturbations, when it comes to improving stability.
Exactly. And I find when we look at a strength athlete and we look at, even someone in the physique side of things in the bodybuilding world, we look at distance or perturbation of movement, like distal challenges to proximal stability. Those are where the greater adaptations lie for both categories. My ability to overcome load over a greater distance allows me, when I move into competition as a strength athlete, to find these very structured and physics biased positions. Like we see the huge arch in the bench press and powerlifting. Well, that's playing a physics game to the criteria of a sport, allowing that person to put on display adaptations to greater distances. If I only did closer at bench press or overhead press and then got to lie down and take an extremely wide grip at bench press, well, I'm now navigating no longer stability and strength, but solely strength through a horizontal vector of force. When we see the opposite happen in bodybuilding, we see posing increase, like the actual ability to execute on stage day, on show day in bodybuilders happen from greater distal challenges to proximal stability. My ability to control my midsection and operate through the length tension relationship of these joints allows me to, look bigger, look drier, have a tighter midsection, hit a vacuum if necessary, but that comes from distal challenges to proximal stability. Can I keep my midsection tight as I distally challenge my arm, as I distally challenge my hip through flexion? And that's gonna arrive on show day to create better posing. It's gonna arrive on meet day to create better strength adaptations.
When you're programming a week, let's say, or even a longer phase, are you going in your mind, let's say my objective is to improve my squat. Yeah. Is there certain go-to exercises that you like? Or are you literally going joint by joint, person to person? Someone may have, hip extension, maybe the limitation versus knee extension in somebody else. How much is that influencing your decision-making on exercise selection?
So what I want to do when I look at programming to, say, increase a lift like the squat is I would look at my time to doing this at a high frequency, my ability to get to someone barbell squatting 2 to 3 times a week. That point will then be when I can make the squat stronger, because I need the skill to do it more often.
So what are the things that are holding somebody back?
So what's usually holding someone back, and so this is where I look at the big 3 lifts, the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, as perturbations to a challenge at the core. I look at the squat as an anti-rotational exercise because of the barbell squat's relationship to the anterior or posterior oblique sling. People might know the Janda upper cross, lower cross, the idea of the left lat and the right hip or glute reacting to one another. We see rotational demand in the squat as oftentimes a challenge to people squatting. In the deadlift, it's very evident that it's flexion extension at the thoracic or lumbar spine is the limitation to deadlift. And in bench press, what's harder to see is it's actually an exercise of anti-lateral flexion or control through adduction and abduction at the shoulder. So our ability to anti-laterally flex will greatly influence our ability to bench press more weight. But in terms of the squat, I would look at the squat being the driver of squatting more, but to underpin a barbell squat would be to look at exercises through the lens of anti-rotation first, because it's my ability to lessen the horsepower necessary to the midsection or to the core and allow the horsepower to generate towards the legs, right? I need to work in parallel, not in series. So what I want to be able to do is go, if the demand to this person is going to be anti-rotation before it's ever quads and glutes, then how do I lock down anti-rotation as an autonomous pursuit of this person? And how do I allow the associative to be the knee flexion extension rotation?
So walk me through that. So there's a few like words that I want to come back to at the end of the podcast to define for the listener. And so this autonomous one is one that I don't think is common. So why don't you walk us through that and then answer the question of how we would autonomous versus associative, and then walk us in the path of how we would start challenging rotation in your eyes or anti-rotation.
Yeah, so when we look at autonomous and associative, we look at associative to firstly be defined as task specific. So dependent on sport or goal, the associative work will always be most specific to the task. For somebody who wants to get better at barbell squatting, a barbell squat will always be the associative work to the client. The autonomous work, this goes back to what you were saying, was the internal versus external stability. Autonomous work will almost always be externally stabilized or will be trained at a far lesser intensity because it's autonomous to this person. It's something they can do with little to no neurological cost.
Got it. So with the objective of pushing them higher up in the associative task.
Right. Yeah, to give them capacity on a physiological sense to, adapt to more muscle fiber, to create better quality of muscle fiber, to allow them when they go to do that associative task, for those muscle fibers to actually react to the task given, right? And we're not just loading ligaments and tendons and joints forever. Now that musculature is working through adaptation when we move to associative.
Very cool. And the other one we start talking about is, what does it look like to train anti-rotation with respect to associative training for a squat? Autonomous training for a squat.
Yeah, so we look at autonomous training for a squat and anti-rotation, we can start to kind of see the forest for the trees and movement selection. We can see an exercise I love is the contralateral front foot elevated split squat. Well, if I look at anti-rotation and I want someone to get better at the squat, I'm not going to give them, a side plank. I'm not going to give them a Russian twist as the ab exercise. I'm going to give them a contralaterally loaded split squat because I'm going to be able to suggest either rotation and controlled through rotation or anti-rotation in the split squat, but I'm adapting to positions of hip and knee flexion as I challenge that anti-rotation. The other benefit of this is a dumbbell rack is infinitely long. And if somebody sat and trained from a 20-pound dumbbell to a 200-pound dumbbell in a front foot elevated split squat, we would see dramatic increases in their ability to express function and strength in the barbell squat. Number one, strengthening through hip and knee flexion, but two, there's a large anti-rotational dynamic to that movement. So in this person's barbell squat workout, exercise A may be barbell squat, exercise C or E may be the front foot elevated split squat with a contralateral load. Exercise B might be a half kneeling or seated lat pull down. We might go half kneeling, ipsilateral lat pull down. We're starting to derive function from adduction and anti-lateral flexion. We're starting to find depression in that lat and most likely upward rotation of the scapula. Now, when we look at people with bad barbell squat mechanics, we often see more horizontal vectors of force being applied to the barbell in which we want to go vertical. So now we're seeing a more so upwardly rotated scapula, more vertical elbow beneath the bar.
Now, this should all be acknowledged that this is with the objective of being a better squatter. So this is where my brain starts to explode when it comes to programming. And as you spoke about, programming is like the bane of my existence. When you start to know too much, it becomes, and that's an ignorant statement, but when you start to know more, it just becomes such an overwhelming task because you sit down and you go, okay, well, who am I writing this for? what are the limitations? What is their main objective? And if you don't know that, it becomes almost impossible. And when you do know that, it's still incredibly difficult to think through, how are they going to manifest over the next week? How is this exercise going to influence this? And, there has to be such an extensive movement assessment and, obviously goal assessment. So many variables, and programming to me is one of the most complex things. And I think when it comes to a high level athlete, the value is incredibly high. But when it comes to an average person, let's talk about that. Average listener to this podcast, let's say, fitness is their top priority in their life. Maybe family and fitness and finances are the top priority, but fitness is certainly up there. How much should they be looking into all these intricacies of programming?
I think programming is underrated in its value, even for the Gen Pop client, and even more so, I think, valuable for the Gen Pop client in attenuating fatigue, right? Like, there's a huge principle, which is skill versus will. And oftentimes when we look at people that quit, when we look at people that are maybe not necessarily the best employees within our companies, I think the first conversation we need to have is, number one, facts versus stories. Like, what are the stories that we tell ourselves, and what are the facts of the situation? But two, more importantly, is skill versus will. Is this person's inability to have motivation or discipline to complete a task based on some inherent quality about them making them not a good person? Not usually. I like to think most people are great. It's usually lesser. It's usually, lesser money in the skill bank account. And the greater skill we have at something, the more willful and motivated we are to partake in that task. I think of this, and I think this is very relatable to probably people who listen to this podcast when it comes to fitness and nutrition, is cooking. People who aren't skilled in the kitchen make far fewer good nutritional choices. When you're skilled in the kitchen, you enjoy being in there, you understand ingredients and how they can be utilized transferably from unhealthy to healthy dishes. And you're more apt to spend the time in the kitchen to prep your meals to eat good things. Now, if I don't like cooking and I have no idea how to turn the stove on, and last time I touched the stove, I burned my hand, chances are I'm going to go to Uber Eats and just order anything to satiate myself because I don't have the skill in the kitchen. Now, as we uptake these categories of skill in all aspects of life and in the weight room, we see a greater ability to have motivation or will to continue to do it. You and I are very good at working out. You and I are both motivated to work out because we enjoy it, because we're good at it. When you go into the gym, you can get a pump. It's going to happen. When I go into the gym, I can do as many pull-ups and the heaviest squat I want to do because I have the skill on any given day to do those things. So even on a day where I may not do the most economical or intelligent training, I have the motivation to go in because there's something in there that I'm so good at. I know I'll get the dopamine release that I did it really well. And I took my shirt off on Instagram, did 10 pull-ups, went home. It was a great day. Because there's a skill surrounding that. Now, every time I went into the gym, I was relearning something and I didn't quite get it. And, the leg press didn't give me a quad pump, and the back squat I couldn't add weight to. Well, it's my skill in those two pursuits that reduced my motivation to do it. It wasn't some inherent quality making me a lesser person than the next person.
Man, so much value in that. And I think there's something to be said there for anyone out there who's a personal trainer or a coach in the way that you sell personal training. One of the ways we do it at the gym, we don't allow people to work with us unless they're committed to 5 times a week for the first 4 weeks for that exact reason, because I strongly believe in the empowerment of understanding what you're doing, being able to do it on your own with some degree of competency and come in and actually get that dopamine. It can be so disheartening to come in the gym and feel like you're just not doing it right. So, trainers out there, coaches out there, when you're suggesting how many sessions a week to somebody, always front loading. And like anyone who I bring in to my coaching or anyone who I bring to the gym is always this intentional high frequency training for the first 4 to 6 weeks, so we can make sure the skill is where it needs to be. Is that typically how you suggest starting programming when skill acquisition is the primary goal?
100%. If someone again lies in really that skill acquisition model, and when I trained in person and now as I train remotely, there's no program that's less than 5 days a week. There are programs that are 5 plus, 1 day of even supplemental work that could fall into more your category of like stress management and even breath work that'll be included with beginner level clients. And it's really only few clients that exist, at the top end of training age or at the top end of their sport that will see less than 4 days of work included in their program. But those are people that have definitely adapted to the skill necessary for their sport. And then probably now, due to the intensity in which they train, need to back off. But I would say 85% of the programs I write are a minimum of 5 days.
So people who are high level athletes, does that often or sometimes necessitate less frequency? Or are you still doing the adjunct kind of autonomous days to ensure skill retention?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of where the play on words comes from. Like we see 3 days maybe in the weight room of a high level athlete, but there's probably at least 2 to 3 adjunct days of a separate skill being acquired elsewhere, right? Like we could see this in the high level athlete that also plays a sport. They may train in the weight room 3 days a week. They're probably playing their sport to an equivalent or even greater amount. And then for any other athlete, like I work with a lot with tactical as well. And, some of those guys might train 3 days a week in the weight room, but chances are 7 days a week they're under a lot of stress. So they're doing something else associated with the skill. Same goes for, even higher level bodybuilding athletes, right? Even if they only hit 3 days in a week, there's something happening outside of that that's probably integrating a great demand on stress to them, where they're acquiring a skill that could be for that person stress management. So that could be yoga, that could be walking, that could be doing logic-based puzzles is a huge cognitive skill acquisition tool.
It's what I call my parasympathetic days. I write parasympathetic days into all my workouts. It's like, you must do this here because it's just such a difference maker in accelerating the recovery curve, right? It's, sitting on your butt and not doing anything is so different than consciously and intentionally recharging your batteries, right? Leaving your cell phone on the counter isn't going to allow it to recharge. Just, simply learn some simple interventions to plug it in. So we kind of went off track there and started talking about programming. I want to wrap up with maybe covering anything with respect to your skill acquisition course that we didn't go through that you think would be very, very important for people to start to understand, to know what you're going to be teaching in the course and maybe what they need to understand with respect to skill acquisition.
Yeah, so the skill acquisition course really starts from day one. Like day one, week one of the course is an introduction to what we've spoken in depth of here, which is the Fitz-Posner skill acquisition model, understanding the cognitive, associative, and autonomous phases and the terminology surrounding it, right? Like we're going to say perturbation, we're going to say autonomy, we're going to say sympathetic and parasympathetic and neurological and physiological. And from day one of learning any skill, there is a cognitive requirement, which is at first the base or first principles of the knowledge of what it is. So week one, we dive right into the base level of what is skill acquisition and how does one acquire motor unit learning. Week two of the course, we go right into what we spoke about, which is the schema theory and understanding a schema is cognition and perception, and how to create graded exposure and what is graded exposure to a task. So in the weight room specifically, how can we create graded exposure through deflection, hip extension, protraction and retraction mechanics, and depression and elevation mechanics, and seeing those often tied to commonalities in movement that'll be programmed is how can we adapt the schema theory of cognition and perception. Week three, we go into the idea of dual task learning and the economy of programming, what we spoke about. How do you attenuate for fatigue and adaptive decay over a week, a block, and a year of training in its entirety in terms of looking at adaptive decay, and really how can I balance the books on how much I'm asking of someone neurologically and how can I back end or continue in a physiological sense while that neurological adaptation recovers.
One thing that comes up, maybe as a reference point for you to look into, is my last podcast I did with Dr. Andrew Huberman. I don't know if you know who he is, but he speaks about, people often talk about focus and say, you can only focus on one thing at a time. And his, being one of the top neuroscientists in the world, has validated that you can actually be in two places at one time, meaning you can have 2 points of focus. And this may be a useful addition to your course, that this reality that most people are, living outside of their body, so they're kind of focused on, or maybe they're in their head, which in their head would then be obviously in the future or in the past. So you're either stressing about the future or you're stressing about the past. So bringing people into the here and now, and I always say, like, be present and be inside of your body. Like those 2 points of reference for me have been a successful adjunct model, like adding it to the repertoire of understanding where I want you to be present. So most people go in the gym and they're worried about their lunch, or they're worried about their spouse or their children or their finances. So giving people the tools, at least the awareness and then the tools to step into being in the present, being focused on the task at hand, and being present inside of my body, I think will accelerate the skill acquisition curve, just simply, as you say, step one, it needs to be awareness. But the fact, as soon as I learned that you can be in two places at once, meaning I could certainly be in my mind being conscious of what I'm doing, and then in my body feeling what I'm doing. So this embodiment of the task was a useful addition to my understanding of teaching people this stuff.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things we talk about in the course currently that speaks somewhat to that is the constraints model, right? Is creating, these environmental and influential constraints on someone to allow them to at first be one place and then adapt to, like you'd said, being more than one place at once, and understanding like how can we create constraints to the environment, constraints to the lifter that create graded exposure to, being more present in a lift, whether that be, the two dowels and the external stability, allowing them to move extremely slow in, say, concentric phases of movement, where oftentimes in a back squat, the eccentric phase you go slower in, and the concentric phase you try to get the hell out of there, and that's never going to improve your ability to be in the concentric phase of the squat. Or those isometrics, in terms of overcoming isometrics, is creating a constraint to the time and the space of the movement, allowing someone to then become more present in those weak positions of a lift. So the constraints model is something we dig deep into when it comes to dual task learning, or being more present to be able to isolate the autonomy from like the associative act.
Very cool. Sorry I interrupted you. I believe you're on week 4.
Yeah, no problem. And then from week 4 to 6, we go through the constraints model itself and implementing environmental constraint. Week 5, we get into a lot of the modality and programming considerations that you and I spoke about. And then week 6, we wrap up with a deep dive into cognitive, associative, and autonomous in terms of how it's qualified and how it's quantified in a workout.
Man, I'm massively interested. I will be attending this course.
Yeah.
Anyone out there who's a trainer or very interested in understanding how to develop great workouts and ultimately how to improve skill, my brain goes to understanding this for children as well. I know a lot of the listeners are parents because I talk about parenting all the time. So anyone, I think there's certainly value for that as well. Where do they find more about the course, Killian?
So they can go to pre-script.com/skill-acquisition, or if you just go to pre-script.com, go to the courses page, there'll be a skill acquisition page that you can go to for more details, as well as if you do have Instagram. I seem to live and die on Instagram, so Killian.Hamilton. Feel free, honestly, to send me a message, and I'm more than happy to answer any further questions and talk more about this. This is what I do all day long.
Yeah, and when Killian started telling me about this course, I was massively excited. One, because his brain needs to be shared with the world, and because this topic is certainly underexplored. So Killian, massive gratitude for you, man. And I know the sky is the limit for this course and for you. And I'm super grateful for your time, man. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben.
That's a wrap, ladies and gents. Thank you very much for tuning into the Muscle Intelligence Podcast, where we focus on targeting our message to help you and your family and your loved ones live your greatest life in a body you love. Like you, I struggle. I've got children, I've got family, I've got businesses, and getting in the gym is not always the easiest thing. So when we do get in the gym, we want to make the most of it. And that's a big piece of what I teach here, but we also want to make the most of all those other things outside the gym that matter, right? There's a lot of information out there that is noise, ultimately, right? There's a lot of people trying to get your attention, talking about complete BS, and everybody's looking for motivation. Motivation is not what you need, right? You need a strategy. You need information, not motivation. And then you need execution, right? You need to take action on these things that you learn. And that's why we're here, to give you valuable information that you can apply to living your greatest life right now. So Killian today talks a lot about programming and this piece of skill acquisition. If you were to spend the next 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, on all the things we talked about in this podcast, your body would change more in the next 12 months than it has in the last 12 years. And I say that with an incredibly high degree of confidence because I've done it and I continue to do it with a huge number of people that enter my world. This is my secret, right? If you talk about what is my secret weapon in getting exponential or exceptional results with people, it's this, is I spend the first 2 to 3 months focusing on acquisition. That's it. And then from there, you've reached this autonomous phase or this autonomic reality. Like I just understand what to do. I have reached unconscious competence, and I can do it. And that is when results really start to flow. So I suggest you guys all start applying all this information. If you want some help from me, you can head over to muscleintelligence.com and pick up one of our programs, because we teach all of this stuff. We've got an awesome new site coming to you really soon, and an app, or you can head over to Instagram and connect with Killian, because he's an absolute wealth of information as well. Today's podcast is brought to you guys by Blue Blocks. Head over to blueblocks.com, BLUBLOX.com/muscle. Gets you hooked up with 50% off. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know. And make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pekulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.